The fluorescent lights hummed at exactly 60 Hz, a frequency Ashley Cooper had learned to filter out somewhere between her third and fourth deployment. She moved through the pre-dawn corridors of Mercy General's ICU like a ghost made of muscle memory, her scrubs whisper soft against the linoleum, her badge hanging at an angle that kept it from catching light. The limp was barely perceptible to anyone not trained to notice it. Most people didn't notice. Most people never did. Her locker door swung open to the smell of stale coffee and the ghost of antiseptic that no amount of cleaning could fully remove from the break room. Inside, a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a half-dead succulent with leaves like paper, and a photograph in a silver frame showing a young man in desert camouflage, grinning at the camera with the kind of confidence that came from believing you were invincible. Jake. Her son. Gone 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. She didn't have to count anymore. The number lived in her bones. Her hand moved to the jacket hanging in the back of the locker, a navy blue windbreaker that had seen better decades. Her fingers traced the inside lining where the patch was sewn, the fabric worn smooth from 1,000 unconscious touches. A small square of faded green, embroidered with a trident and 3 letters. She didn't look at it. She never looked at it. The gesture was automatic, ritualistic, like a prayer whispered to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper had died in her mind the same day Jake did. Now she was just a nurse. Just someone who checked vitals and documented observations and stayed invisible. The shift brief started at 6:45. Ashley took her place at the far end of the table, a cup of coffee warming her hands, regular, black, 2 sugars, because routine was the only thing keeping her vertical these days. The senior nurses filtered in, the ones who'd been at Mercy General long enough to earn the good assignments, and they clustered together like birds recognizing their own kind. They didn't cluster around Ashley. They never did. She'd learned early that friendship required stories, and stories required a past that made sense, and her past made sense to exactly nobody. Dr. Marcus Hargrove entered the conference room at 6:58, which meant he was 2 minutes early enough to appear conscientious but not early enough to seem desperate. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. His tie was silk, the color of old money. His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of a man who'd climbed every ladder available and had learned to smile at people on the rungs below him. He was handsome in the way sharks are handsome, all predatory elegance and angles designed to cut. Ashley had learned to recognize predators. It was a survival skill. "Good morning, people," Hargrove said, setting his own coffee, some complicated contraption with oat milk and 3 pumps of vanilla, on the table. "We have 17 beds tonight. Let's move through them efficiently." His gaze swept the room like a searchlight, pausing on each face long enough to assess, never long enough to connect. When it landed on Ashley, it didn't pause at all. She was background. She was competent but unremarkable. She was exactly what she'd worked to become. The rounds began. Bed 1, pneumonia, responding to antibiotics, discharge likely tomorrow. Bed 3, post-op cardiac surgery, stable vitals, pain managed. Bed 4, stroke patient, rehab placement pending. Hargrove spoke in the rapid-fire cadence of a man accustomed to being listened to, and the residents and nurses around the table scribbled notes and nodded at appropriate intervals. Ashley wrote nothing. She'd learned to hold the information in her hands, in her muscle memory, in the part of her brain that had been trained to remember everything because forgetting could cost lives. Then, new admission. Bed 7. Colonel Richard Whitmore, 62, presenting with chest pain. EKG showed T-wave inversion in the anterior leads. One of the residents, a young woman named Chen who still had idealism in her eyes, spoke with the careful precision of someone who hadn't yet learned that clinical presentation could be ignored if the right person decided to ignore it. He's anxious about the findings, but vitals are currently anxiety-induced, Hargrove said. The words fell like stones into still water. Older gentleman, probably read something online, now he's convinced himself he's having an MI. Classic presentation. We'll run troponin, clear him, discharge. Next bed. Ashley's hand stilled. The coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. She set it down with deliberate care, the small clink of ceramic against formica barely audible over Hargrove's transition to Bed 9's presentation. But she wasn't listening anymore. Her mind had arrested on a single detail: Colonel Richard Whitmore. Kandahar Forward Operating Base. 3 years ago. The man who'd commanded her son's unit. The man who'd written the letter she kept folded inside her locker, the one she'd never opened because opening it meant accepting that Jake was really gone, and she wasn't ready for that acceptance, not yet, maybe not ever. The briefing continued without her. Around her, chairs scraped back from the table. Nurses dispersed to their assignments. The morning shift was beginning, and Ashley remained motionless for exactly 3 seconds before her training took over and she stood, moved, became functional again. Just a nurse. Just someone doing her job. She walked toward Bed 7 with the careful neutrality of a person who'd learned that showing emotion was showing weakness, and weakness got people killed. Colonel Whitmore lay in the hospital bed like a man uncomfortable with the constraints of illness. His shoulders were broad, his frame carrying the lean musculature of someone who'd spent decades taking care of his body the way soldiers took care of their weapons: maintenance, discipline, the understanding that your equipment was your responsibility. His wife sat in the chair beside him, her hand on his arm, worry written across her face in letters large enough to read from the doorway. Their son, or grandson, Ashley couldn't tell, paced near the window, checking his phone every 15 seconds. "Good morning, Colonel," Ashley said, her voice settling into the neutral professional tone she'd perfected over 3 years. "I'm Ashley, your primary nurse this shift. How are you feeling?" His eyes lifted to hers, and something happened in her chest. His eyes were grey, storm grey, the color of Kandahar dust kicked up by helicopter rotors, and they contained something that looked like recognition. "You look familiar," he said, his voice rough from sleep or pain or both. "Do I know you?" "Doubtful, sir," Ashley said, already moving to the monitor, checking his oxygen saturation, his heart rate, his blood pressure. 88/56. Not good. Not immediately catastrophic, but not good. His oxygen was 92%. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in Bed 6, reminding her that numbers could drop quickly in places like this. "I'll be monitoring your vitals and medications throughout my shift. If you need anything, there's a call button." She worked through his chart with the kind of focused precision that came from muscle memory. The EKG was in his file, T-wave inversion in leads V1 through V4, the pattern that spoke of anterior wall ischemia. The troponin hadn't been drawn yet. His last blood pressure from the night shift was 91/58, which meant it was trending downward. She palpated his neck, feeling for the jugular venous pulse, and what she found made her hands want to tremble. But hands didn't tremble. Hands stayed steady. Hands stayed professional. His JVD was elevated. Markedly elevated. The venous pressure rising in his neck was like a voice shouting something that needed to be heard, and nobody in this hospital seemed to be listening. She finished her assessment and stepped back from the bed, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who wasn't panicking, who was just doing her job, who would never dream of overstepping scope of practice or questioning the clinical judgment of a physician. "I'll be back to check on you in 30 minutes, she said. "Try to rest." But she didn't leave. Not immediately. She went to find Dr. Hargrove in the physician's work area, where he sat reviewing charts with the casual confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own judgment. He looked up from his screen with the expression of someone interrupted during important work. "Doctor," Ashley said, keeping her voice level as deep water. "The patient in Bed 7. His JVD has increased since night shift and his heart sounds are muffled. We should consider cardiac tamponade and get a bedside echo before discharge planning." Hargrove's fingers stilled on his keyboard. He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, and something flashed across his face. Something that looked like anger dressed up as irritation. When he spoke, his voice contained the kind of patience a parent uses with a child asking foolish questions. "The patient is anxious," he said. "Anxiety increases heart rate and changes the clinical picture. A bedside echo is unnecessary and expensive. He turned back to his screen. The dismissal was absolute. Continue standard monitoring. Troponin will come back negative, and he'll go home. That's all. Ashley nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't press. She simply returned to the ICU and continued her work, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd performed these tasks 10,000 times, who could start a central line blindfolded, who could identify a pericardial effusion by the way a patient's breathing changed. But her mind was elsewhere, running calculations, watching the colonel's vitals like a chess player thinking 5 moves ahead. 1 hour later, his blood pressure was 86/52. His oxygen had dropped to 90%. His breathing had changed, shallow, almost labored. His wife had noticed it too. She was gripping his hand tighter, her face creasing with worry that had moved beyond concern into something sharper, something that knew fear. The colonel's wife caught Ashley as she emerged from the room after another assessment. Her name was Margaret, and she had the look of a woman who'd been married to a soldier long enough to know the difference between normal and not normal, between acceptable risk and actual danger. "He's getting worse," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "He's breathing harder." And the doctor said he's just anxious, but Richard's not anxious. Richard survived 3 combat tours. He doesn't get anxious. Ashley paused. Around them, the ICU moved with its own rhythm, alarms chirping at intervals, nurses moving between beds, the sound of suction equipment and ventilators creating a symphony of machines keeping people alive. She could feel the weight of what she knew, the knowledge sitting in her chest like something that wanted to be said. "Your husband's symptoms need closer observation," Ashley said carefully. "I'm monitoring him very closely. If anything changes, I'll call for help immediately." Margaret's hand found hers, and the grip was strong, a woman accustomed to holding on. "Thank you," she said. "For actually listening. For actually seeing him." Ashley didn't trust herself to respond. She squeezed Margaret's hand once and released it, moving back into the ICU where the colonel lay in bed 7, where his vitals were telling a story that everyone except his nurse seemed determined not to hear. Outside the window, Savannah's morning was fully arrived, humid and thick, the kind of Georgia heat that made asphalt soft and patience thin. But inside Mercy General, under the fluorescent lights that hummed their eternal 60 Hz song, Ashley Cooper remained exactly what she needed to be, invisible, competent, and absolutely certain that something catastrophic was coming. She just didn't know yet that Dr. Marcus Hargrove had already decided exactly how he was going to make sure she took the blame when it did. 20 minutes after Ashley suggested the diagnosis, Dr. Marcus Hargrove returned to the colonel's room with 3 residents trailing behind him like satellites in his orbit. The colonel's wife sat rigid in the visitor's chair. Their adult daughter stood near the window, arms crossed. Hargrove positioned himself at the foot of the bed with the precision of a man arranging a stage for a performance he'd already rehearsed. "Nurse Cooper," he said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "Step forward, please." Ashley moved from the monitor station to the foot of the bed. Her hands hung at her sides, perfectly still. "I understand you've been providing medical diagnoses to our patients," Hargrove continued, each word enunciated with theatrical care. "Tell me, did your nursing program cover differential diagnosis? Or are you perhaps confusing your scope of practice with that of a physician?" The residents watched. One of them, a second-year resident with nervous eyes, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The colonel's daughter glanced at her mother. Ashley took one measured breath. "I was reporting assessment findings, Doctor." "Assessment findings." Hargrove's smile sharpened into something with teeth. "How generous of you to assess beyond vital signs. Mrs. Patterson, please forgive our little Florence Nightingale here. She sometimes forgets that 20 years of medical training might outweigh her, what was it, Cooper? 2-year nursing degree." The words landed exactly as intended. The daughter's face flushed. The colonel, confused and medicated, looked away. Ashley stood perfectly still. Her jaw didn't clench. Her voice didn't crack. She took another measured breath, and one tear formed in the corner of her right eye, not from fear, not from shame, but from the sheer weight of standing in a room where a coward was performing dominance over the body of a man she owed everything to. She wiped the tear away without looking down. Her eyes found Hargrove's and held them like a sniper acquiring target lock. "You're absolutely right, Doctor," she said, her voice like still water. "I should have waited for someone qualified to notice he was dying." The room went completely silent. One of the residents actually stepped backward. The colonel's wife's hand flew to her mouth. Hargrove's face flushed crimson, but he recovered quickly, turning away with a dismissive wave as if she'd said nothing of consequence. But everyone in that room had heard it. Everyone knew what she'd just told him without raising her voice above conversational level. He would make her pay for that. He would make it systematic. The next morning at 0700, Ashley entered the break room for shift change. For veteran nurses sat around the table with paper coffee cups and breakfast sandwiches from the cafeteria. Nurses who'd worked ICU for 15, 18, 20 years. Nurses who'd watched her work. Who'd seen her competence. Who'd appreciated her quiet professionalism for the 6 months she'd been on the unit. The moment Ashley sat down with her thermos, pulling out a container of yogurt and granola, the 4 nurses exchanged glances. Not hostile glances. Frightened ones. They understood the hierarchy at Mercy General better than anyone. Cross Dr. Hargrove, and you cross the entire institutional machinery. One by one, they stood. Gathered their things. Left without a word. Ashley opened her thermos and poured coffee into the metal cup. The smell of hazelnut creamer rose with the steam. She sat alone in the empty room, yogurt container resting on her lap, and ate with the kind of deliberate calm that only comes from having learned long ago that hunger and loneliness are just data. Pain is information. Isolation is just another tactical position to survive. On the second day, the same nurses repeated the exodus. On the third day, only one nurse attempted to sit, an older woman named Janet who'd been on the unit since the hospital opened in 1998. She sat down, opened her coffee. Hargrove walked past the break room window, looked directly at her, and that was all it took. Janet stood, collected her thermos, and left without even making eye contact. Ashley didn't look up from her lunch. On the 5th day, Hargrove posted the write-up during the morning huddle. Bright yellow paper. Impossible to miss. The header read in bold capital letters, Nurse Ashley Cooper, formal written warning. The violations were listed in clinical detail, unauthorized patient education. Overstepping scope of practice. Undermining physician authority. Creating family anxiety through inappropriate medical commentary. Every nurse on the unit saw it during assignments. Every doctor. Every resident. The paper was stapled to the unit board right next to the patient census and the visitor policy. Ashley read it once, her face a landscape of absolute composure. No flush of anger. No trembling in her hands. Just a woman reading words about herself in a hospital hallway at 06 for 5 on a Tuesday morning. One tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, just one, and she wiped it away without looking down. Then she turned to face Hargrove at the nurse's station across the unit. Her voice was a knife wrapped in velvet. "I understand completely, Doctor. I'll be more careful about noticing things you've missed." Hargrove's eyes flashed. But there were witnesses. Residents. Attendings. The charge nurse hovering nearby. He couldn't respond the way he wanted to. Instead, he smiled, a smile that didn't reach anything human in his face, and turned away to speak to one of the first-year residents about discharge planning. That afternoon, he called her St. Ashley in front of 3 residents as she was restocking the medication cart. The nickname was delivered with the precise venom of a man who'd just realized he was dealing with someone whose composure was unbreakable and whose restraint made her more powerful than any outburst could ever be. St. Ashley. The name was meant to diminish her. Instead, it echoed through the unit like a call sign nobody had earned the right to use. What Hargrove didn't know was that this colonel, the man in bed for with the cardiac concerns, had led her son's unit in Kandahar. Had written the letter she kept folded in her locker, the one she read at 3 in the morning when the nightmares wouldn't let go. Had held Jake's hand in a dusty field hospital when 18-year-old Private Jacob Cooper was bleeding out from a blast fragmentation wound that never should have happened, that everyone knew was entirely preventable, that had taken him anyway. This colonel had given her son the dignity of not dying alone in the dirt. She'd walk through fire. She'd break every rule in the hospital. She'd sacrifice her career. She'd do it without hesitation and without ever looking back. Because that's what you did for the people who'd carried you when you couldn't carry yourself. That evening at 2,300 hours, the colonel's cardiac monitor started showing subtle changes. A flattening of the ST segments. A slight elevation of the pericardial pressures that only someone reading the waveforms carefully would notice. Ashley was reading them. She was always reading them. That was the thing about military training, you developed the kind of peripheral awareness that didn't shut off just because you'd taken off the uniform. The colonel's wife had left hours ago. The night shift was understaffed, 2 nurses calling out with the flu, leaving the unit underwater and moving through the hours like people wading through deep current. Ashley was assigned to the colonel despite having requested reassignment 3 days ago. The charge nurse, under Hargrove's influence, under the understanding that this was a punishment, specifically placed her there. Hargrove wanted her to fail. Wanted her focused on the colonel. Wanted to engineer a situation where she'd either break protocol and expose herself or follow protocol and watch a patient decline. He had no idea what he'd actually assembled. The charge nurse, Diane, avoided Ashley's eyes when she assigned her to the colonel's room at 2,245 hours. Not as punishment, exactly. Nothing so direct. Just a reassignment for the night shift, she'd said, her voice studiously neutral. The colonel was stable. Routine vitals every 2 hours. He'd sleep through the night, probably, and Ashley could spend the hours restocking supplies, updating charts, staying visible to the rest of the unit so nobody could say she was hiding. The subtext hung in the fluorescent air like anesthesia. Hargrove had made a phone call. Diane had answered it. And now Ashley would spend her shift in the room of the one patient she couldn't afford to lose, where every hour would test whether she could follow protocol while watching a man die from a physician's indifference. Ashley entered the colonel's room at 2,300 hours and something had shifted in his breathing. Not dramatically. Just the smallest change in the space between his inhalations. His color had deepened, not blue, not yet, but dusky where it had been pink. The monitor showed sinus rhythm, his heart rate at 102. His blood pressure had crept from 130/85 an hour ago to 118/72. Falling. That slow creep that nobody else tracked because nobody else was looking. She moved through the assessment with the kind of clinical precision that came from field medicine, where you had minutes to gather everything your eyes and hands could tell you before the casualty died from something you could have fixed. Distended jugular veins. There. The subtle rope of his neck standing fuller than it should. Muffled heart sounds. She listened with the stethoscope for a full 30 seconds, hearing the normal lub-dub pattern submerged under something else, something muted, as if she was listening to his heartbeat through water. Pain is information. The colonel was drowning in his own pericardium. Blood accumulating around the heart, compressing it, squeezing the chambers closed. Cardiac tamponade. The same condition she diagnosed 2 days ago and that Dr. Hargrove had dismissed as anxiety. She should call. Page the covering physician. That's protocol. That's what a nurse does. She escalates, she documents, she notifies. But the covering physician tonight was Dr. Patterson, an internal medicine resident in his 3rd month who deferred all cardiac questions to Hargrove, who had made it abundantly clear that Ashley's assessments were not welcome. A page would go unanswered or answered with dismissal. By the time any attending agreed to evaluate the colonel, by the time any real intervention was authorized, he would be in frank shock. She had maybe 90 minutes before blood pooling around the heart would drop his cardiac output past the point of recovery. The pericardiocentesis kit was in the cardiac crash cart, exactly where it had been for 3 years since Ashley started at Mercy General. Nobody had ever questioned why she knew where it was. Nobody had asked about the muscle memory in her hands, the way she'd arranged supplies before without thinking, the competence that came from having done it while IED explosions rocked the FOB and a Delta Force operator bled out from a sucking chest wound in a tent with no ceiling. She pulled the crash cart into the colonel's room and closed the door. Her hands moved on their own, the way they always did in the field, when thinking got you killed and muscle memory kept you alive. Sterile field. Chlorhexidine prep. The colonel's eyes opened as she swabbed his chest. "What are you doing?" His voice came thin, uncertain. Even oxygen-deprived, he was asking permission rather than demanding it. "Saving your life." No inflection. Not defiant. Just information. The fluid around your heart is compressing it. In a few minutes, your pressure will crash and you'll lose consciousness. In a few minutes after that, your heart will stop. This buys us time. She didn't wait for him to respond. She positioned the needle at the xiphoid process where the sternum ended, angled it 45 degrees toward his left shoulder, exactly as she'd been trained by a Navy corpsman named Chen who'd talked her through it while rounds detonated close enough to shake the cot. The needle advanced through the chest wall with a sensation like breaking ice. She felt the pop of the pericardium giving way, that sudden loss of resistance that meant she'd pierced the sac containing his heart. Blood filled the syringe. Not dark venous blood but bright red, fresh, evidence of acute bleeding, confirmation that she'd been right all along. 60 milliliters. She drew it back steady, her hand locked in place like a surgical laser, her breathing unchanged. The colonel's blood pressure monitor beeped its climbing numbers, 95/50 to 105/60. His color shifted in real time, the dusky tone brightening toward pink. His eyes tracked hers. "You're a..." He couldn't finish. "Medic." "A long time ago." She pulled the needle free and applied pressure to the site with gauze, her other hand reaching for the code button without looking away from his monitor. "For minutes. Maybe 5. That was what she'd bought him. Long enough for the crash team to get him out of this room and into the cath lab where a real cardiac intervention could create a pericardial window, drain the accumulated blood properly, save his life the right way instead of the field medicine way, the way that kept people alive when doctors weren't available and the alternative was death. The team arrived in 90 seconds. They always came faster for chest pain than they did for falls or sepsis. The fellow leading them, Costillanos, cardiology, 4th-year resident, stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved across the setup. The blood-filled syringe. The sterile field. Ashley's hands positioned exactly as they should be, calm as moving water. Recognition flickered across his face, followed immediately by understanding. This was a pericardiocentesis. This had been done by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice had gone formal, the kind of formal that came before accusations. Ashley met his eyes. No one. He was dying. Costillanos looked at the monitor. At the improved pressures. At the clear evidence that the tamponade had been confirmed and partially relieved. At a patient who was no longer in cardiogenic shock. He made the choice that physicians who'd actually saved lives knew how to make: stabilize first, ask questions later. Get him to the cath lab. Full cardiac surgery prep. He was already on his radio, already moving, already treating this as the emergency it was instead of the non-emergency that protocol said it should be for a nurse who'd overstepped. The ICU nurses surrounded the stretcher and the colonel was gone, rushed toward the OR, his blood pressure still climbing. Ashley disposed of the needle, cleaned the sterile field, documented her vital signs assessment in the chart. 2,345 hours, muffled heart sounds consistent with pericardial effusion, JVD noted, patient in apparent respiratory distress. Pericardiocentesis performed at bedside by Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, 60 milliliters aspirated. Patient stabilized, transferred to cardiac surgery. She noted every detail without editorial comment, without qualification, a clinical record that anyone reading it would understand was the documentation of an emergency intervention performed by someone with medical authority and medical training. By 0400 hours, the colonel was stable. The cath lab had placed a proper pericardial window. The bleeding source had been identified, a small tear in one of the coronary arteries from the initial cardiac event, and had been sealed. He was alive because Ashley had recognized the tamponade and because she had acted before the institutional hierarchy of Mercy General could tell her no. By 0600 hours, security appeared at the ICU entrance. Ashley Cooper. The officer's name tag read Martinez. She'd seen him around the hospital for 3 years and he'd never been unkind to her. He looked apologetic now. "I need you to come with me." The charge nurse turned her face away. Nobody met Ashley's eyes as she followed Martinez down the corridor, past the nurse's station where 3 people suddenly found reasons to look at their computers. The rain had started outside the windows, a steady hammering against the glass that sounded like applause from people who weren't watching. Hargrove's office was on the administrative floor, 3 levels up. The conference room adjacent to it held a risk management consultant she'd never met before, and her personnel file spread across the table like evidence at a crime scene. The consultant was a woman in her 60s with a kind of professional exhaustion that came from cleaning up other people's disasters for a living. "Ms. Cooper, we need to discuss the procedure you performed at approximately 2,345 hours. She didn't gesture to a chair. Ashley stood instead, her hands at her sides. "The pericardiocentesis. You performed it without physician authorization. The patient was in cardiac tamponade. That's not a legal authorization, Ms. Cooper. You exceeded your scope of practice as a registered nurse. Hospital protocol requires that any procedure of that complexity be ordered and supervised by a physician." The consultant kept talking, her words moving like a checklist: unauthorized medical procedure, patient safety violations, scope of practice, hospital protocols, endangered patients. Ashley heard them the way she heard wind in a distance, inevitable and distant. This was why she'd left. "We also need to discuss your medical training." The consultant opened a folder. "On your nursing application, you listed no prior medical background. No military service. No advanced training. Yet you performed a complex cardiac procedure with what appeared to be professional competence. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Ashley could explain it. She could say, Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper of Naval Special Warfare had served 12 years in SEAL teams and Delta Force, had trained combat medics, had performed emergency procedures in battle conditions on 3 continents, had earned her qualifications in blood and sand and the impossible choice between protocol and keeping people alive. She could say, the woman who'd done those things had died in her mind the same day her son died in a field hospital in Kandahar, that she'd walked away from the Navy with PTSD so crushing she couldn't bear to hear her own call sign, that this quiet nursing job in Savannah had been supposed to be where nobody knew what she'd been, where she could move through days without the weight of all those lives pressing on her chest. She said nothing. "Ms. Cooper?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, "I can't." The consultant closed the file. "We're going to place you on immediate suspension pending investigation. Your behavior suggests either undisclosed medical training or a willingness to fabricate competence you don't actually possess. Either scenario is grounds for termination." Ashley left the conference room at 0600 hours with her credentials suspended and a bus pass that suddenly felt like a rope tightening around her throat. The rain was heavier now, the kind that soaked through scrub fabric in seconds. She drove to Mercy General to collect her things. They wouldn't let her access the unit, so she sat in the parking lot and waited for Diane to bring down the cardboard box they'd packed for her. Inside was the cracked mug from her locker reading "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, the half-dead succulent she'd tried to save for 3 months, and the photograph of Jake in his combat uniform, grinning, alive and gone, and the reason she'd done any of this at all. She was standing at the bus stop on Abercorn Street at 0700 hours, soaked through, when she realized Hargrove had won. The rain had stopped by morning, but Ashley's scrubs were still damp when she clocked in at 0600 hours. She'd spent the night on her sister's couch in Jacksonville, the cardboard box beside her like a monument to failure. She was a nurse at Mercy General again because she was a nurse at Mercy General. The hospital hadn't fired her, legal had determined you couldn't terminate someone for saving a life, even unauthorized ones. So they'd moved her. ICU to medical surgical floor. A demotion that needed no explanation. But that wasn't what happened to Hargrove. By the time she was changing into fresh scrubs, he'd already been on the phone with Marcus De Vere, his fraternity brother, a vascular surgeon who sat on the hospital board. "We need to talk about protocol violations," Hargrove had said, his voice steady as a man managing his own disaster. This nurse performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight. It was dangerous, unilateral, and, he paused, selecting the word carefully, psychologically concerning. De Vere listened. De Vere was accustomed to these calls. By 0800, Hargrove had contacted 3 of Ashley's references from her nursing programs, questions about her psychological stability, her judgment under stress, whether she'd ever shown signs of impulsivity or command issues that might suggest instability. The references, older nurses, retired educators, offered careful, non-committal answers. But the seeds were planted. The narrative was being constructed. A rogue element. A liability with a stethoscope. He'd also called in Richard Halverson, the outside risk management consultant who specialized in hospital defense litigation. Halverson had a reputation like a scalpel: precision, no sentiment, outcomes that protected institutions at the expense of individuals. Hargrove provided him with the pericardiocentesis incident, the write-up from the previous week, the references Hargrove himself had poisoned. Halverson built the case in 4 hours. Psychological unsuitability. Pattern of boundary violations. Risk to patients. Grounds for termination, even in the face of the life she'd saved. The board review was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Ashley didn't know any of this. She was restocking linens on the med-surg floor, making her body small, her presence smaller. The other nurses had stopped talking to her, not out of cruelty but out of caution. Hargrove's influence moved like invisible current through the unit. Talk to her, and you might be next. By 1100 hours, an HR representative appeared at her station. The woman's name was Janet Reeves, and her expression carried the bureaucratic sadness of someone who'd delivered bad news so many times it had become muscle memory. "We need to speak in my office," she said quietly. The office was small, smelled like hand sanitizer and resignation. Security had walked her there, that part was protocol, though it felt like punishment. They'd stood outside the door while Reeves pulled up the file Hargrove had constructed, document by document, narrative layer upon narrative layer. "Your medical training," Reeves began, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if the words might burn her if she typed them. "Why wasn't it disclosed during your hiring?" Ashley sat across from her, hands folded in her lap, and said nothing for 3 seconds. The right answer would require explanation. The right answer would require speaking the truth she'd spent 3 years building a wall around. "It wasn't relevant to the position," she said finally, her voice level. "I applied as a registered nurse. That's what I am." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. Reeves leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking under the weight of her discomfort. "The procedure you performed on the colonel, the pericardiocentesis, you performed it with competence that suggests advanced medical training. Combat medicine training, based on the technique. Dr. Hargrove says it was concerning. He says it suggests boundary issues, possibly judgment issues." Reeves's eyes met hers with something close to apology. "I need to understand why you never disclosed this background." Ashley's jaw clenched once, then released. Measured breath. The same breath she'd learned in pre-deployment briefs, in the minutes before insertion, in field hospitals when the electricity cut and they operated by flashlight. "Because Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper died the day my son did," she said quietly, each word exactly the weight it needed to be. "I walked away from Naval Special Warfare in 2019 with PTSD that made me unable to hear my own call sign without breaking. I came here to be nobody. I came here to save people without anyone knowing what I'd been. This job was where no one knew who I was." Reeves stared at her, processing. "And I walked away because if I'd stayed, I would have hurt someone or hurt myself. So I didn't stay. I became this instead." Ashley's hand gestured at the desk, the office, the whole careful lie she'd constructed. A nurse. Just a nurse. Not Senior Chief Cooper. Not Phantom. Ashley, the med-surg RN who kept her head down and did her job and didn't ask for anything except to not be noticed. The silence stretched. The board review is in 2 weeks, Reeves said finally. Dr. Hargrove has filed a formal recommendation that we terminate your employment. Risk management has concurred. We're moving forward with the legal process. She paused. But I'll note in the record that you've attempted to cooperate and that you saved the colonel's life. That matters to some of them. Not to the ones who mattered. The rain had started again by the time Ashley left the hospital that afternoon, and the rain was still falling when she stood at the bus stop on Abercorn Street 2 hours later, waiting for her shift to end so she could be officially escorted from the building. The cardboard box had never left her car. Her life's belongings, a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in letters that had faded from handling, a half-dead succulent that had somehow survived 3 months of her neglect, and a photograph of Jake in his combat uniform, Delta Force insignia on his chest, grinning at the camera in a way that meant he already knew something was coming and didn't care, because he was 24 and invincible and certain. All of it soaked now. All of it worthless except for the photograph. The rain hammered against her shoulders like judgment. She'd given Mercy General everything and received notice of termination in return. Hargrove had one. The narrative he'd constructed was airtight, the board would concur, and by next month, Ashley Cooper the nurse would be fired, discredited, a cautionary tale about scope of practice and boundary violations. Hargrove would remain a surgeon. He would keep his position, his privileges, his carefully curated professional reputation. But that wasn't what happened next. By 0900 hours the following morning, before Ashley's shift even began, before Hargrove had finished his morning coffee in the physician's lounge, the hospital board received a phone call from the colonel's adult daughter, the lawyer from Washington, D.C., the one who'd been asking pointed questions about the woman who'd saved her father's life. She had a document. She'd been looking for clarification about Ashley's background, and her father had finally found the words to explain. The letter he'd kept in his nightstand drawer for 4 years. The letter he'd written the day after Jake Cooper's memorial service at Fort Bragg. The next morning, the sounds came first. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The steady rhythm of military bearing crossing the lobby of a civilian hospital, and the lobby staff went quiet the way civilians do when they recognize the presence of actual authority, the kind that doesn't need a title to enforce itself. The SEAL liaison officer was in dress uniform, navy blue, chest full of ribbons, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change simply by existing. Behind him came 2 officers from Naval Special Warfare Command, both with the same flattened effect, the same eyes that had seen things the lobby staff hadn't. Security didn't stop them. Something in their bearing made stopping them impossible. They proceeded to the board conference room. The hospital CEO received word. Hargrove received word. HR received word. An emergency meeting was called. Ashley was pulled from her med-surg shift at 09 for 5 hours. She entered in her scrubs, her hair pulled back, no makeup, completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. The conference room held the usual suspects, the CEO, Hargrove pale as a ghost, HR, the risk management consultant, and now the SEAL liaison officer, who stood as she entered with the kind of recognition that made her stomach drop. The reveal happened in layers, like a medical briefing, each layer delivered by a different voice, each one building toward something Ashley couldn't yet see but could feel approaching like a storm. Ashley Marie Cooper, the colonel's daughter, began, reading from the document her father had finally explained, the words shaking slightly, service number 765-98-3421. 23 years, 8 months, and 14 days of active service. Hargrove shifted. The CEO leaned forward. The colonel's nurse entered next, the same nurse who'd watched the board meeting unfold, and handed a military file to the liaison officer with trembling hands, her face streaked. She read aloud, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Command. The gasps around the table were audible. Hargrove's face went the color of old bone. The liaison officer continued, Special Operations Combat Medic, attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DIVGRU, multiple combat deployments, Afghanistan Theater, Kandahar Forward Operating Base. He opened a folder, and the photographs inside made the CEO stand. Combat Action, 2017 through 2019, 17 confirmed save lives under fire incidents. Then the decorations. 3 Navy Crosses for extraordinary heroism in combat. His voice was formal, ceremonial. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor device. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. Combat Action Ribbon. Each medal landed like a hammer blow. The room was dead silent now, except for the liaison's voice, steady and relentless. Combat Rescue Medic. The techniques she performed on Colonel Harrison were standard emergency cardiovascular intervention that she personally taught to Delta Force medics at Fort Bragg. The pericardiocentesis that saved his life was textbook execution of procedures she'd trained hundreds of special operations personnel to perform. Hargrove could not move. Could not speak. His world was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing he could do but watch. Call sign, Phantom, the second NSW officer said quietly. Senior Chief Cooper trained Delta Force operators, Green Berets with 5th Special Forces Group, SEAL Team 3, SEAL Team 6. She personally saved 47 special operations personnel in forward operating bases under active enemy fire. She saved hundreds more through the training protocol she developed. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Then the colonel's daughter, tears streaming, spoke the final truth, Lieutenant Jake Cooper, Delta Force, my father's command sergeant major in Kandahar. Senior Chief Cooper's son. KIA, October 2019. She was holding his hand when he died. 40 minutes under mortar fire, and she never left him. Her voice broke. She saved my father's life last week because she couldn't save my brother. And Dr. Hargrove tried to fire her for it. Ashley's face showed the first crack. One tear escaped, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with anyone in the room, the gesture carrying the weight of 20 years of command, of never showing weakness except in solitude, of bearing weight that would have crushed anyone else 3 years ago. Senior Chief Cooper voluntarily left Naval Special Warfare in 2019, the liaison officer said, after her son's death, suffering from severe PTSD. She walked away from a career trajectory that would have made her a Master Chief, disappeared completely, requested anonymity to heal. We've been looking for her for 4 years. She chose to serve quietly, as a civilian nurse, asking for nothing except the chance to be invisible. The CEO stood, turning to Hargrove with an expression of absolute fury. 1 week later, Ashley was restocking supplies on the medical surgical floor when the colonel's eyes opened fully for the first time, really opened, tracking the ceiling, then the machines, then the doorway where she stood holding 4 bags against her chest. His hand lifted, trembling not from weakness but from recognition, and he whispered a single word that made every nerve in her body go rigid, Phantom. The silence that followed was the kind where you can hear fluorescent lights humming overhead like they're trying to hold the weight of what just happened. Ashley didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't acknowledge that he'd just called her by a call sign she'd buried 4 years ago in a Virginia cemetery next to her son's photograph. The colonel's daughter was in the room, early 30s, eyes red from days of vigil, and she leaned forward, her father's hand trembling in hers. Dad, what did you say? But the colonel wasn't looking at his daughter anymore. He was looking at Ashley, and his lips formed 2 more words with absolute clarity, my medic. What happened next happened fast, the way truth moves once it starts moving, like a boulder rolling downhill with nothing to stop it. The daughter stepped into the hallway, her phone already in her hand, and made a call that would end careers. Mom? The colonel is asking for someone. Yes, his nurse. I think she might be. Yes, I'm going to find out. 20 seconds later, she's decorated military. Yes, I'm sure. He called her Phantom. Look it up. Look it up. Hospital leadership moved like they'd been struck by lightning. The CEO appeared on the floor at 1:51 p.m. Ashley checked the wall clock out of habit, the way soldiers mark time, his expression somewhere between confusion and fury. Behind him came a man in a Navy dress uniform so crisp it could cut glass, the insignia on his collar identifying him as a Navy SEAL liaison officer attached to the Pentagon Special Operations Command. The liaison carried a classified file folder the color of original parchment, worn at the edges from hands that knew how to move with authority. They asked Ashley to step into the family consultation room. Not requested. Asked, but in that tone that means the same thing. She set down the 4 bags on the medication cart and followed, her movement steady, her breathing controlled, the same composure she'd perfected over 23 years of keeping her voice level while making split-second decisions that meant the difference between someone walking out of a hospital or being wheeled out in a black bag. The colonel's daughter spoke first, her voice shaking with the particular intensity of someone who'd just pieced together a family secret. The colonel served under you in Kandahar. Isn't that right? He led the unit that. She didn't finish. Didn't have to. The SEAL liaison's eyes had already locked onto Ashley's face, the look of recognition military people have when they're standing next to a legend they didn't know was standing next to them all along. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, he said. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered the way you'd read someone's rank during a formal recognition. 3 Navy Crosses. Combat Medic, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, attached to JSOC Task Force 121. 12 years active duty. For classified deployments. You trained our Delta Force medics in advanced trauma procedures. You saved 43 lives that we can document. Probably more. The CEO's face went through 5 different expressions in the span of 3 seconds, confusion, then anger, then something that looked like the exact moment he realized what he'd almost done. Behind him, through the glass wall of the consultation room, Dr. Hargrove stood in the hallway outside the board meeting they'd been conducting, the one where he'd been presenting his documentation, his case, his carefully constructed narrative about an insubordinate nurse who'd exceeded her scope of practice. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see Ashley's face. He could see his fraternity brother on the hospital board, the one he'd called that very morning to ensure the firing went smoothly, now standing with his hands pressed flat against the glass like he was trying to push away from reality itself. The SEAL liaison continued, his voice carrying the kind of precision that comes from briefing presidents. Senior Chief Cooper performed a pericardiocentesis under field conditions in Iraq in 2015. Saved a 3-star general's life. She trained 12 Delta Force medics in the exact procedure she performed here at Mercy General on your patient. She did it because the procedure needed to be done, because she recognized the clinical presentation, and because the officer in that bed led her son's unit in Kandahar. A pause. Heavy. Intentional. Her son was killed there in 2019. The colonel held his hand during evacuation. He wrote her a letter she's kept for 4 years. Ashley's jaw clenched, just barely, just a fraction of a millimeter, but the liaison saw it. That recognition between soldiers. That understanding of what silence really costs when you're carrying bodies home. Outside the glass, Hargrove's network was unraveling in real time. His phone had started buzzing at 1:52 p.m. The hospital board member who was his fraternity brother, the one who'd assured him the firing was a formality, was calling to explain, his voice carrying the particular cold tone of someone who'd just realized he'd been built into a liability. The board is requesting your immediate resignation. Effective now. We have documentation of systematic harassment, retaliation, and this is the critical part, Marcus, you actively prevented a qualified medical professional from saving a life. That's patient endangerment. The risk management consultant who'd spent for days building a termination case sent an email at 1:55 p.m. I will not be continuing my engagement with Mercy General. Returning consulting fee of $8,000. Suggest you retain outside legal counsel immediately. By 2:03 p.m., the nursing school that Hargrove had contacted to ask about Ashley's psychological stability had called the hospital's HR department to report his inappropriate and leading questions designed to discredit a former student. The charge nurse from the day shift, one of the nurses who'd stood in silent solidarity with Ashley during the break room exile, had given a formal statement documenting the systematic exclusion, the public humiliation, the written warning posted on the unit board. Hargrove was summoned back to the conference room at 2:53 p.m. The CEO was there. The hospital's legal counsel was there. The SEAL liaison was still there, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, the picture of military patience. They didn't ask Hargrove to sit down. "You have two options," the CEO said, his voice like a judge reading a sentence. "You resign immediately, effective today, with a neutral reference. Or we terminate you for patient endangerment, harassment, and retaliation. We have documentation, the written warning posted publicly, witness statements from staff, records of pages you ignored during the colonel's critical event, emails to outside parties requesting information about an employee's mental health status. This is not a negotiation." Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. The weight of the moment, the realization that the authority he'd built through political maneuvering rather than clinical excellence was collapsing like a house built on sand, visibly buckled his shoulders. "I resign," he said. Effective immediately, the CEO confirmed. Security appeared at Hargrove's office at 3:15 p.m. The same guard who'd walked Ashley out with her cardboard box 2 days ago now held an identical box in his hands. His expression was the kind of satisfied that comes from witnessing karma operate with perfect precision. "Dr. Hargrove," the guard said, his voice carrying the weight of a formal delivery, "I believe you know the way out." Hargrove packed his diplomas, his family photos, his expensive desk accessories that had meant something to him when he'd believed they represented genuine accomplishment. He walked through the ICU where nurses watched in silence, not the hostile silence of contempt, but the weighted silence of people who'd just witnessed the exact moment someone's constructed reality shattered. He passed the colonel's room where the patient and his family watched him leave in disgrace, and the colonel's daughter made eye contact with him just long enough to ensure he saw what he'd almost cost them. By evening, Hargrove's medical license was being reviewed by the state board. His malpractice insurance carrier called the next morning to inform him his coverage was being cancelled effective immediately. His wife filed for divorce papers 2 weeks later, unable to bear the weight of the scandal that had transformed her husband into something unrecognizable. 6 months later, Hargrove sat at a folding table outside a strip mall on Victory Drive in Savannah's summer heat, wearing a cheap polo shirt with an insurance company logo, trying to sell supplemental policies to people who walked past without making eye contact. His medical degree was framed in a box under his bed at the extended stay motel where he now lived, month to month, a living monument to the moment he'd chosen pride over competence and lost everything when competence arrived and exposed the void where his authority had never really been. But that wasn't the story that mattered anymore. Ashley stood in her apartment, a real apartment now, not the efficiency she'd been hiding in, holding the business card the SEAL liaison had left on the table during their conversation. Hunter Army Airfield. Combat medicine instructor. A phone number handwritten on the back with a note, "Call when you're ready." No pressure. Just service. The colonel had made a full recovery. He was home with his family now, and he'd written her a letter she kept next to Jake's photo, the one in the frame on her nightstand, the one she no longer kept hidden. The letter thanked her for saving his life. It told her that Jake would be proud. It said that healing doesn't mean forgetting and serving doesn't require silence. The faded unit patch, the one she'd sewn inside her jacket lining 4 years ago when she'd tried to disappear into civilian life, now hung on her wall beside Jake's photograph. No longer hidden. No longer a source of shame. She'd started seeing a trauma counselor 3 weeks after Hargrove was fired. Real sessions, real work, the kind of heavy lifting that comes with finally admitting that pretending you're not who you are is a heavier weight than actually being who you are. On a Tuesday morning at 8:38 a.m., Ashley made the call. The SEAL liaison answered before the second ring. "Senior Chief. Was wondering when we'd hear from you." "I'm ready," she said. 2 weeks later, Ashley walked into Hunter Army Airfield in civilian clothes, jeans, a grey shirt, no badge, no nameplate, nothing that marked her as anything other than what she was, a woman returning to work. She met with the Special Operations Medical Training Battalion commander, a full-bird colonel with eyes that had seen things and understood things without needing explanations. They didn't need her to be Phantom again. They needed her to teach. To pass on the skills that save lives. To take everything she knew about keeping people alive under conditions that would break most people and give it to the next generation of medics who'd carry those skills into places where they'd matter more than anything else in the world. She accepted the civilian instructor position with no hesitation. Her first class was 18 Delta Force medics, average age 28, average deployments 3, average loss something they'd never quite admit to anyone but other soldiers. They sat in a classroom that smelled like industrial carpet and old coffee, and Ashley stood at the front with her hand steady and her voice calm and everything about her carrying the particular authority that comes from having survived things that don't have names. I'm Ashley Cooper. Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired. I lost my son in Kandahar in 2019. I walked away from this work because the weight was too heavy. I came back because I realized the heaviest weight is pretending you're not who you are. She wrote on the whiteboard, Beck's triad, muffled heart sounds, distended jugular veins, hypertension. This might save your brothers. This saved a Delta Force colonel at a hospital in Savannah. Let me teach you how. On her desk, the cracked mug reading World's Okayest Nurse, the succulent that had finally started thriving again, and Jake's photograph in its new frame. She kept her scars. She kept her limp. She kept the tremor with morning coffee. They were part of her story now, not flaws to hide. Across town, Hargrove sat at his folding table, sweating in the heat, watching people avoid eye contact. At Hunter Army Airfield, Ashley taught a young Delta Force medic how to identify Beck's triad, how to prep a pericardiocentesis kit, how to move with confidence when everything else is falling apart. Her hand steady. Her voice calm. Her purpose restored. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please subscribe, like, and comment. Tell us, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? We read every comment.